On this episode of Technically Leadership, let's do a deep dive into the similarities and differences between the management track and the staff engineer track for technical leadership in an organization. Joining me to share their experience are Nick Silkey, who chose the management track, and Martin Smith, who chose the staff engineer track as an individual contributor, or IC. Nick currently is a senior director at DigitalOcean, and Martin currently is a principal SRE at HashiCorp. We'll find out how they made their decisions, what the experience has been like, and their advice on various situations. Let's get to it. Welcome to the first episode here of Technically Leadership. I'm Laura, the host. You would have already heard by now the introduction for my two guests, but I have with me Nick Silkey and Martin Smith. Nick has gone the management track. Martin has gone the technical IC leader staff engineer track. And I want to kick off this conversation about the differences between IC and management, like choosing those two tracks with why. How did you, each of you, pick the direction that you picked? And was there a moment that made you go, this is what I want? So Nick, you're first on my screen, you're unmuted. So why don't you start? How did you pick this direction in your career?
Yeah, I had some experiences really early in my career where the roles kind of blended. Like I was an IC, and it was like, hey, we'd love for you to take on some people management responsibilities. And that was kind of a mixed bag. It let me get some experience, but I didn't really have strong kind of real ownership there. And it was a real binary decision for me at my last employer. So when I was working at Rackspace, I started there as an engineer, and working with my manager, we kind of reached the point of, I think, people management is a good right next move career-wise. And Rackspace was very deliberate with, we don't like the blended roles. They really like this idea of if you're ICing, you're ICing, and if you're managing, you're managing. And I think that was a really positive experience for me. Because it was kind of very deliberate with kind of jumping from A to B, it meant that you could kind of focus and invest with like your management chain and like other people at the business to get prepared to be the most successful people leader you could be.
Right.
As far as what motivated me, I really enjoy working with people, helping people, guiding people, growing people. Like it just really fills my bucket. And I saw high opportunity to be more effective at doing that, leading people and leading organizations. And so that's something that really drew me towards it, like a moth to a light. I enjoy it. I think I do a good enough job at it, and I want to get better at it and do more of it. And so that's really kind of what pulled me towards that decision, Laura.
Right. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Martin, was there a moment for you? And I should probably preface this by saying all three of us were at Rackspace around the same time. So did it happen to also happen at Rackspace that you made this decision, or was that maybe even before? I don't know. I'm curious.
Yeah. For me, it was before Rackspace, actually. I think for me, I had a couple of opportunities when I worked at a large public university. If you look me up, you'll know exactly where I'm talking about. But I had some chances to both manage people directly and then also sort of do the player coach kind of thing that Nick described. And, there were definitely parts of it that I enjoyed. And I think it's a really valuable role. But I found two other things to be true for me. One was that it often happened when I was like the most senior person on a team already. And so if I was going to be the manager or take that kind of role, I ended up losing the opportunity to do some of the technical work. And I was best positioned to do it often as the most senior person. The other thing I found is that it wasn't the thing I thought about. You have those moments where you finish your day and you're like stuck on a really hard problem, and then you like give yourself some time and you come in the next day and you're like, oh, I've thought about it and stewed over it and I have a solution now. Most of mine were technical. And I think that there are managers that come in. I believe this to be true, that there are managers who really think about interesting and creative ways to solve problems with teams and organizations. But they weren't me. They weren't the thing I woke up and thought about. And so at that point, I said, this is super valuable that someone does this, but it's just not giving me the kick that I want. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is that I feel like as an IC, and I don't know, I'd love to know if Nick feels like this is true, but I also am constantly, at least in the tech world, given the opportunity to change again, right? People are always assuming that ICs want to go into management. And so there's, no matter where I've been and where I'll be, I think I will always be asked when there's an opportunity for another people manager to step into that role. And so I feel like I'm also constantly saying no to that opportunity.
Yeah. I was going to say in this visual medium that is podcasting, uh, when you said that managers often they come in the next day and they're thinking about the people problems that they solved overnight or something like that, Nick and I both pointed at him because that's very much a Nick thing. So I think that's kind of funny. But that's an interesting point, though, about that ICs often get that opportunity to go into people management even after you go into the technical IC track. People keep trying to push you into management. I don't think it goes the other way. Nick, does it?
It actually can. So I know of a
Really?
couple people at my current employer who they were really strong technical leaders and they made the jump into people leadership and they did a good job, but it wasn't for them and they stepped back. And it was a very good, I think like the org supported them kind of going from A to B. And so the ability for you to rope out does exist. And so that's really positive. And the other thing too, as well, I think as an IC, like Martin mentioned, kind of like a technical career track, you have the opportunity to flex into like this people/org area
Mhm.
without getting manager on your business card. Like I have an engineer currently who's working on a big project where he's in a staff role, but he's doing like EM style work, like helping lead a team. And it really is a blend of like management/technical work. And it's going really well. Like he's doing a great job. He's feeling really successful and accomplished with, helping the team get what the team needs to be successful with this large project. And I'm also really supportive of it too. And so even though I spent some time talking about how it's a very binary decision at the top, your ability to flex and kind of pivot of like I was enjoying this, but now I think I might not. And it maybe your org too as well, right? You may be
Hmm.
like, hey, I enjoyed being a manager before, but in this org that I enjoy and don't want to leave, I would love to transition back into like an IC style role. Definitely exists, as well as if someone like Martin or someone at that level being able to flex their people leadership or their org leadership skills in ways that are very strategic and make sense without it being a career pivot where you got to get new business cards.
Hmm. Interesting.
I think too, something people don't always assume about these two roles is that, I think there's some misconceptions. Like people assume if you're the manager, you suddenly have all this power and you can shape the direction, right? You're fully in control of the destiny of the team and the decisions you couldn't convince your team to make before as an engineer. Now as a manager, you'll have your way. And I think that's actually in some ways the opposite. I feel like as a senior IC, as an individual contributor, I have the same concerns that managers have. I'm worried about the team health. I'm worried about our execution. I'm worried about so many things that are the same as what managers are worried about. But it doesn't mean that either managers or I always have the power to make some sweeping change, right? Like my relationships and the way that I get involved in execution are the ways I make changes. And I think those are true for me, at least, regardless of what the role looks like. And in fact, like Nick said, there are times where I will step into, a role because I'm working with an engineering manager who couldn't make a meeting and I'll give the planning readout or
Right.
couldn't, is on parental leave. And so it's like, okay, well, I don't mind having one-on-ones with these people and helping them with their professional development. And it's not
Mhm.
that managers or I do that any better. It's just that they have some things they have to do that I don't. And there are some things that I have to do that they don't, right? Like they can point to me in the same way and say, Martin, we really need you to lead this technical conversation on solving this hard problem and giving us a vision for the next 6 months for the technical roadmap.
Mhm.
But I can also tell them, I need you to, you know, you have to do all these reviews for review season at your company, or you have to coach this person, or I'll even do things like send a manager some feedback and say, I don't know if this is right. And they have the hard job of taking the feedback from all the different people that somebody works with and figuring out if what Martin said is even true.
Right.
So they have hard jobs, and so do we, but also they're very similar and very similar
Hmm.
concerns.
Yeah. So if somebody's trying to make this decision and think that, oh, well, if I go into technical IC, it means less meetings. That's not true, is it?
It's definitely not true for me.
I mean, I hear that a lot from like mid-level engineers, sometimes even senior engineers. They have this misconception that somehow magically, if they decide to go the technical IC track, that means they won't have any meetings. But if they're a manager, they have to do all meetings and they never get a chance to try something different. So I don't know. Is that even a thing with managers? Like, do managers get a chance to try
Um,
the technical things here and there?
well, there's kind of they certainly can, but it's usually the case that if a manager goes too upside down with that proportion where they're like
Yeah.
trying to get too deep in the technical weeds, they end up underserving their prime directive of being a people manager, a team leader, and
Hmm.
so a manager's always got to watch out for that. Um, the one thing I will say though, like there's an interesting observation you have where it's usually when someone crosses over from like a senior eng role into like a staff role. They
Hmm.
come to this self-realization within the first like 30, 60, 90, 180 days where they're like, man, I'm not writing as much software anymore. I'm writing a lot of Google Docs and specs and RFCs and it's really good to let them know that like that's normal and okay because their role really
Hmm.
has up leveled, right? It's a very good thing to kind of get really comfortable with of where you differentiate your skill with what's needed out of a staff or a principal role is not 10,000 lines of code cranked out over 40 hours. It's that
Right.
higher order kind of knowledge work of really guiding things through a technical lens to be a really strategic partner for these people and these org leaders.
You bring up a good point because I think that there are quite a few managers out there who don't really know how to support a staff level or higher engineer because it's almost a little too far beyond their experience. And so, Martin, I guess I have what kind of advice would you give to a manager who maybe they see one of their senior engineers becoming a staff engineer for the first time? Like, how do you support that if you don't necessarily know what they should be expecting? Like, what would you point them to advice wise?
It's a really good question. I think I've definitely been on the other side of this as
Yeah.
an individual contributor with a manager who had a particular scope and a particular, set of results that they were trying to drive. And then I was like moving into a role where my view might even be higher level than that manager, right? They're solving problems that their team is trying to solve. Whereas I'm thinking about, okay, but what about all the teams? And could I make more of an impact with this team over here than the one that is my manager's team right now? And I would say like some of the things I would recommend to a manager like that would be, to be sure you understand like what the person you're managing is working on and understand like how they're thinking about the priority of those things. And if they mention things that aren't part of the team, follow up on that, ask more. Sometimes you can even get them sort of in a three-way conversation with a director or a senior director and say like, gosh, like you're working on this really great stuff, but I'm, as your manager, I'm not in charge of, like, I'm not held responsible or accountable for delivering it. So you
Hmm.
should go meet occasionally with the person who is. And I think like getting those people that are like that on your team that are sort of moving up to that staff or principal level, even just the FaceTime with other leaders in your
Right.
organization is like really, really valuable. But I think also another thing would just be giving them some of that room to do it too, right? I think make sure you talk to them about like what is their goal, right? If they're going to work with another team, what is their goal? What are they hoping to bring back from it? Does it result in a work stream that's long lived, right? Are they building a new
Hmm.
system that is going to be around for a long time? Or are they building a system they're going to hand off to the team that they're working with originally on it? So I think it's just like being really clear about those expectations and why they're doing it. I can say from my own experience as well, the more that I've done that, the more I also feel quite autonomous. And I think a lot of these folks, if you're moving in that direction as an IC, you'll find that eventually you're reporting to those higher level folks too, right? They're saying
Right.
you're not. It doesn't make sense for you to report to this manager. You should probably report to this director, or you should probably report to this VP. And that almost comes naturally too, because you're starting to meet with them. You're
Yeah.
talking about their concerns and deliverables, not your individual managers. So Yeah, just those are some things I can think of to support an IC going through that role. I'll also just tack on there, not every IC is going to want to do those things.
Yeah,
And so you shouldn't assume, there's this up and out attitude at a lot of places where it's like, if you're not going from level 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, like, what are you doing? And there, at some point that breaks down because you're also, not every IC wants to be doing this. You could be a deep expert in, some encryption technique and deliver a ton of really awesome value to your company and be a senior engineer, but still not, drive a project or work across multiple
right.
teams. That's fine.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Nick, do you have any like thoughts from the other side of the coin? Like you've kind of guided some of these staff principal engineers, and like what would be the advice you would give? And do you see the same things from the other side?
It's interesting because the same way you could make the statement that like not all managers are like kind of created equal. They don't all run the same place because they're all different people and they all come from different backgrounds and they're responding to that which is needed kind of by the business. There's some managers who are really like adaptable and malleable, right? Like they can
Right.
respond to like waxing and waning of the business. And there's those who are like, nope, I'm just the so-and-so manager, right? And they may be very
Hmm.
successful with as the so-and-so manager. There, you could make the same statement about engineers, right? They can make their way to a staff level, but they might be, like Martin said, really focused in an area. Like I'm the one who does all of the Ceph or VXLAN or whatever. And so you might end up with a very specialized kind of staff or principal person, but their scope stays really focused. And then there's other staffs or principals where as they grow and they're adaptable, they expand to the waxing and waning of kind of business needs, right? Where you get into, like Martin said, working with VPs around value propositions of why doing a big project makes sense and helping with kind of organizational and business substantiation around a major one-way door decision or something like that. And so like I think Martin nailed it where like not everyone who's a manager or staff needs to follow this very linear kind of progression path. How you succeed is going to be based on like who you are as a person, what you want out of your role, what the business needs out of your role, and then like what's the load within, like where does the business want to go, and then like what does the business have load wise right now. Like those four things tend to factor into what the journey looks like as a staff engineer growing to be successful to the next level of like principal, for example.
Right. Right. So basically, you kind of have to own where you want to go, whether you want to go into more of that wider range of thinking about a whole organization as a staff principal engineer versus whether you want to stay fairly narrow. So I guess this kind of gets into like your IDP. You're kind of defining that yourself.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think like not only are you in charge of your individual development plan, but I think Nick said something really interesting too, which has been my experience was, which is it also depends on the what the business needs, right? If there's
Hmm.
not a need for a really wide reaching principal, right? I'm currently holding a principal SRE role. If the business wasn't interested in reliability across all the products, I probably
Hmm.
wouldn't have gotten that promotion. I
Right.
mean, I'd like to think I did a lot of really good things too, but I also think that if that's not a priority, it's not unlike how there might not be a director or VP of a part of the business if there's not a need for it.
Mhm.
One thing that's really helped me think about my role is there's some like Will Larson staff engineer books and a podcast, and I found it really therapeutic just to hear from other engineers working at that level of like how they work, what kinds. I think some of the examples in that write up is like you could be a VP's right hand person, or you could be the tech lead, or you could be the
Mhm.
person that is helping with a big merger, or right. There's like all these different things that you could do, I think, and still fall into the same general like staff engineer, but there's so many archetypes. And I think sometimes there's not a need for one of those archetypes when the business doesn't need it, right? If you're in a very small startup, like you probably don't need a ton of mentoring. You don't need to do a ton of mentoring if there's like only one other colleague. Like, I guess
Yeah.
you're mentoring all the time, but you may, if you really love mentoring or you really love doing one of these things that like grows an engineering org, there may be the appropriate time and place for that in your company, or there may not be.
Right. Right.
That's a really interesting point, Martin. One of the more recent like C-level leaders that I encountered in my current role, That person gave me some feedback where they about me, and they said, "Wow, you're really adaptable." And I thought that was a really powerful observation, because I think that that adaptability component is true regardless of these two career tracks, right? What I know about Martin Smith is that he's very adaptable, like his ability to jump into different business problems. Like I have demonstrable history with him where I think he would be successful there. In contrast to, say, pick a very specialized, hey, I really know like low level kernel drivers for NVIDIA H100s, blah, 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 generative AI, right? That adaptability and that ability to kind of be aware of what's important to the business, as well as what resources and constraints do you have in the business to go be successful with where the business wants to go. That's a really powerful thing to get a good handle on, of being adaptable, regardless of which of these two career tracks you pick.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think something I do all the time is reevaluate that list too, right? I think the longer you've been in sort of one of these senior IC technical leader roles, the more you're autonomous sometimes too. And so you're constantly, I think just like a VP or a C-suite person would also do, is like checking your assumptions, checking your priorities against the other signals you've got and say like, does this make sense? And so I can go across my entire day and work on 3 or 4 different things, checking my assumptions, weekly with my manager or with other leaders and say, like, what's the most important problem to you right now? What are you seeing over here? What are you seeing over there? And not only being adaptable, but like having to do that independently, right? Like not waiting for your manager to come tell you, oh, by the way, you know, this person over in this part of the business has a really interesting technical problem. Like you kind of have to have a little bit of your ear to the ground to know that, to see that those things are happening. And then constantly, I feel like it's a litany that I just repeat of like, I think the current order is A, B, C, D. Is that still the right order? Do you think that's, in the next week I ask the same thing, like it's still this order, right? And so you have to be like both adaptable and then like be willing to pivot yourself and work on something else or deprioritize something. I think one of the hardest things I'm like dealing with right now is also being really explicit about deprioritizing stuff too in one
Yeah.
of these senior technical leader roles, is saying, not only am I not going to do this right now, but I know it's because this product is more important and they have this problem over here. And so it's like, it's really tough to juggle changes that are happening constantly in a business, that especially one that has lots of products, or
Yeah.
lots of product lines or lots of features in a
Mhm.
product, right? Like you're constantly reevaluating.
Yeah. Would you say that's the same, like if you were in the manager track, you're obviously doing different evaluations. What would those be? Because you're not really getting the chance to move your priority to go work on some other project in the same way that a staff engineer might have more mobility. As a manager, you don't necessarily have that mobility. Or am I reading that wrong?
I think so with what Martin was saying, I actually think it's the prioritization thing's really killer, right? Because the higher up you get in the org, your surface area gets wider for you to have the opportunity to work on more things.
Mhm.
And having that alignment with your leader, especially if you're reporting into like a VP or C level, right? You want to talk about surface area, they've got a lot.
Yeah.
And so your ability to be really crisp with them on what your priorities are is a really important thing. And it doesn't mean you need to come out and you know, you're not asking them, hey, what should I work on? Right. Like that's a huge miss if you're like a staff or a principal or a
Hmm.
director, right? But it's, hey, let me align with my leadership on what my priorities are, because I've had folks run that same play in one-on-ones, whether they're a staff or a people leader, right? With just like, hey, boss, I
Hmm.
think my priorities are this. How does that land with you? Right. And the boss goes, absolutely, Martin, you crushed it. Or Laura, 100%. Or, hey, you know what? No, I think they're actually this. Right. And so your ability to very quickly kind of align with your leader, regardless of your career track, I think is actually kind of the same play. It sounds like Martin was
Yeah.
hinting to kind of the same thing of like, Martin's got his list of what he thinks important, and he uses a feedback loop with his leader, whoever that may be, whether it's a VP or
Hmm.
a C level or something. Martin thinks he should be working on this. What do you think, Martin Boss? And Martin Boss goes, yep. I've been doing that for a while. Like ever since I started reporting up into a VP, they're so busy. You need to be able to very quickly and easily articulate, what have you gotten done? What do you need help from them on? And what are your priorities? And that goes over really well with drawing increased alignment with your leader. And the same play works well if you're a staff or a principal.
Right.
I think too, like it doesn't mean that the other work isn't important and the business doesn't need to deliver it, right? Like in some ways, it's actually a compliment to that team, right? It's like you actually don't need a staff engineer to do this right now. Like you're going to deliver it, you're on track. I mean, for me, that even happens where there are certain kinds of projects where it makes a lot of sense for me to be there at the beginning, but not the end. And there are other projects where it makes more sense for me to be there in the execution, but not in the design of the whatever the thing is, like right early on in the project. So it's not necessarily bad either that there isn't that there's a project that doesn't need a staff engineer or that focus at all. I think that that's totally normal and it's not a problem at all. I think it's actually, I think one of the other big challenging parts about being an IC is that you do sort of like float up onto a team or to a group of people and say like, I want to help. And then there's a lot of ways that can be received, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think actually it's like, it's not an easy thing for sure. I think people sometimes think that, oh, you're a senior IC, you could just like hop around and like work on whatever you're interested in. And it's like, no, it's actually quite difficult. And a lot of times you're entering into like a situation that's already had a problem. And that's why your leader was like, yeah, you should go look over there. Or you're, showing up with a team that feels good about what they're working on and doesn't think that they need you. And they're like, is it a bad sign that you're here? They're reading into why you're here. So it's like a really delicate thing to do. I think that's something actually our X space that was paramount for a lot of leaders was like everybody showed up with a shovel when there was something to do. And I think that not all companies are like that, but as a staff eng, you definitely need to have that kind of perception, right? Like if a team won't meet with you, you can't help them accomplish their goal and they can't be afraid of meeting with you. And sometimes you're even willing to do a little bit of like trading of priorities, right? I'll never forget there was one team I worked with who was like, I showed up, I wanted to work on this one project and they were like, this is really not our top priority. It's this other thing. And I was like, okay, actually, that's really great to know. And they're like, we can't work on this top thing. And I said, I'll go work on it. And then when I come back and I get that set up for success, then you'll work on my thing. So I think there's so many like human dynamics and organizational dynamics when you're trying to navigate those priority lists. But yeah, it's not bad that you leave something either. And in fact, it feels unfinished because you're often like sort of this island and you're working on the hardest problems. If anybody working in tech right now knows that like a lot of tech companies can't decide what the hardest problem is and it's constantly changing.
Yeah. So you end up mostly being the paratrooper, coming in, parachuting in to figure out the problem. And then I guess parachuting out doesn't really quite work, but it kind of does.
Yeah, you're either doing that or you're like maybe you're working on an initiative that has a lot of projects and you're like going from one to the next on a theme or something. But yeah, a lot of times I think that's a hard thing to learn also as a senior IC is that you're one person and you may have the biggest idea in the world and it may be like this amazing thing, but if it requires a team behind it, you got to go find that team or you got to go advocate to make that team or you got to go do something because you can't, that's one of the reasons speaking of choosing what path you want to be on is that I always felt like I could only build so much by myself. And like, as an IC, that's the same challenge when you're a leader, right? You can give a presentation, you can pitch something, but like without a team, it doesn't last long.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I guess the one big thing I'm hearing kind of touching on the main topic of this podcast, like we were saying, is this line between IC and management. The more I hear both of you talk, the more I hear there isn't a line really, other than where you sit in the org structure. You're doing a lot of the same things. You have to have a lot of the same skills. Just a question of just how much technical work are you doing versus how much people HR work you're doing, I guess. If that makes sense. So how would you decide? What would you tell people are like the main decision factors? Is it, oh, I prefer working with people over tech? Is it like what kind of misconceptions are there and how do people make that decision? And maybe how do they decide if they went down the wrong path? I know I just did a stumper here at the end. I promised I wouldn't do the hard ones and then here I am doing the hard ones.
No, it's all good. I think so one of the things that I've noticed is that like I have really good spidey sense in spotting future leaders. And that sounds really like condescending, but it's based on the experience where, just working with folks, I know it when I see it. And one of the things I know I tend to do is I try to give people opportunities to like work that muscle. And it can be something extremely innocuous, like leading retros, right? Or
Mhm.
little small things like that to give them experience of, they're not writing reviews for their peers, but it's inching them towards, hey, is this something you would like to do? Because that allows them to figure out whether that drained them or if it filled their cup. And
Right.
so little small things like that are great strategic, um, try before you buy,
Hmm.
low cost ways to give someone experience flexing a muscle they maybe haven't historically done, to let them know whether they like it or not. Because it always gives them an easy out too, of like,
Yeah.
I started doing this and Silky, I can't stand this. Right, put me back in the IDE. Like I'm done. And, okay, that's cool. Like it's not a big deal. Like, and I know you're probably going to ask, like, well, tell me more about that Spidey sense. I kind of don't really know. I think it kind of boils down to, developing software in organizations in exchange for a paycheck is a highly social sport. We've talked about how this is true across both of these tracks, and there's kind of like characteristics, or the same way you can kind of be around your neighbor and learn really quickly whether they're going to be a good neighbor or not or something, I don't
Yeah.
know, or a really there's something like that where, a leader will kind of spot something in an IC, and the leader will look to find ways to connect them to opportunities to see if that makes sense for them or not, in a low cost, low barrier to entry, low overall cognitive cost with a good easy exit.
I would say, like, for things you could try to do, or how do you know that you want to be a technical leader that's not a people manager? I think, like, if you see opportunities for two teams to do something that they were doing separately but together, right? That could be one. Like, I'll never forget one of the first times I did that, and I had like three different teams in three different parts of the business that were like all working on a project to automate roughly the same thing. And I was like, oh, if we just like spent 5% more time, like, and so
Yeah.
if you see something like that, pitch that, like, go talk to the people involved. Or if you're not sure if you have permission, like, talk to your manager about it and say, like, oh, I see this opportunity, like, can I go run that down? I think also something that I probably don't do as much as I should is, like, sometimes the business needs people to think ahead on the technical side. And so, like, that's free. Anybody can do that, right? And you don't
Hmm.
even necessarily have to have the right ideas or the right direction for something to get the feedback you need, right? You could propose the most outrageous, like, weird direction for some project. That alone will stimulate people to respond with what they think the directions should be. But, like, just thinking out a little bit ahead and saying, like, gosh, I think there's these like four problems that in the next year we're going to need to solve. Like, is there any way we could position ourselves to solve them? Like, we're going to add multi-region, so could we figure out state replication for this thing that we run? Or just like thinking a
Hmm.
little bit ahead, um, and writing it up and just sharing it around and saying, like, what do you think about that? And you, like I said, you could be completely wrong with the solution, but like you're still effectively setting the roadmap for your
Yeah.
team technically. So you could like take a swing at a lot of those things. It's totally free, right? You just write it up on your own and share it around, and if it bombs, oh well. Like,
Yeah.
um, I would also say, like, one thing about the IC track, I'm actually interested in Nick's feedback here, but for me, it also, like, I love working with people. So I would not say that, like, if you're a staff engineer, you're gonna not work with people. I think you absolutely are. But in some sense, it's still very lonely, because I think, if you're reporting to a director or a VP, you're maybe one of two engineers, and most of the other people reporting to them are senior managers or directors themselves. So, like, you're no longer on the kind of team. If you really love that sort of like software team, this may be different than that. Or you may like dive into some of those and dive out of some of those. And you have to be comfortable with like that loss, right? Like, the team I'm working with right now is like grown, and maybe it's going to specialize, and it might, speciate or divide into two teams. And like, I'm like,
Right.
oh man, that's a bummer, because I really like working with all those people, but it's going to be two teams. And probably I can't stretched into working with two teams all the time. You don't want to go to double double the sprint ceremonies and double but at some point you have to like walk away from a team too. So that can be a real bummer.
Yeah. Yeah, Nick, do you see that kind of Martin was looking for that feedback about the people question? Like, do you see that as a big differentiator when it comes to, like, let's say deciding whether you are going to go into management or not? Like, do you think that people is like doing the people work, watching people grow? Because it sounds really like both sides have the same opportunities in some
Yeah,
ways.
does management feel as lonely
Yeah.
as I described? Like,
It is
or
extremely lonely, Martin. And that's a very good thing to be clear with
Yeah.
people when they first get into this of like, you're going to feel, even if you have peer managers around you, that they're part of like a reporting chain up into your boss, you're going to feel isolated. You're going to feel lonely because you're inherently a single threaded process or resource of a team. Right. And so that's just inherently isolating. And so that's a good thing to get really kind of comfortable and familiar with. And the way you fight that is, growing your network and growing your back channels, right? Much in the way Martin probably has connections with all sorts of other staffs in his role, in his org. He probably uses that for feedback loops, driving his own self-improvement, fighting the loneliness, all those other types of things. It's a very common theme, regardless of which track you're on. The thing that was really interesting for folks around this idea of trying stuff, it's very common for an IC who thinks they want to be a manager to approach their boss and go, "Hey, I think I'd like to kind of be a manager, and hey, what can you do for me, boss?" Right? And they kind of lay the problem at their manager's feet, and the manager's got 40 plates they're spinning, and now they have a 41th one. And what I usually kind of guide people towards, let's take Martin. Let's say he had an interest in growing from the role he's in now into people leadership. Martin probably knows to do this already, but I would definitely coach Martin on like, hey, approaching your leader with like, hey, I think I'd like to gain some experience here or gain some manager experience or whatever. Don't say, what can I do? Or what would you guide me towards? Bring the thing that you think makes sense to take off that manager's plate. Right. You know what your manager does. And so your ability to go, hey, I'll pick on the retros thing. Hey, what if I start running retros? Right? Take it off your plate or something. Right. It's a way, because then the cognitive burden to that manager is next to zero. Right. Because you've come to them, you've expressed intent, and you've come to them with a proposed solution that, unless they violently object, they're probably going to say yes. Because they would love to connect you to that opportunity. And as long as it makes sense to them, they're probably going to thumb it and say, heck yeah, let's go. Let's have you do this for 30 days and let's check in after and see how that went. And if we want to do more, keep it, augment it, whatever. Really strong advice for somebody who is in an IC role, who's thinking, maybe I want to cross over and get manager on my business card. How can I do that in a safe way? How can I quickly do that? How can I do it in a controlled way where I don't get overloaded, burn out, but I also have an exit?
Yeah, makes sense. So I will say, unfortunately, we are at time, or just about at time. So I just want to say thank you both for joining us. Thank you for helping me kick off this podcast series. This was a really nice reunion in some ways for 3X Rackers. But is there any last thought? I will say we'll do the hot takes, which people will find out about later. We'll do the hot takes in a minute. But any last thought you would love to share on kind of this line between management and IC? Either one of you want to unmute and start first? I can see both of you are thinking hard about what is that thing that you would like to share.
Your spot, I think we've nailed it, that it's a really strong Venn diagram with high overlay, right, around people and organization and communication and collaboration and influencing without authority and all that sort of type of stuff. But I think when I kind of step back, there's a quote that was kind of all over the walls and t-shirts and stuff at Rackspace that came from one of the founders. And I take it with me everywhere because it really kind of guides, it guides a lot of what I do. And I've noticed that it guides staffs and principals and distinguished as well. And it's what we all want is to be valued members of a winning team on an inspiring mission, regardless of which of these two tracks you're in. That seems to really guide like the ethos of the people who are successful in each of these tracks with whatever they're working on.
I have the management book and it's in there. I was just trying to grab it. So anyway, Martin.
It's definitely one of my favorite quotes too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like sometimes if you're thinking about that, take the opportunity, if you're thinking about the IC track, to sort of imagine what it could look like. I would say if you're trying to make this decision, like imagine what you would look like as a manager of an engineering team. Imagine what it would look like if you were a staff engineer. Like what sorts of things would you stop doing? What sorts of things would you start doing? Are those even possible in your current setup, or like do you need to ask for to be more well positioned to work on the projects that need those? Or yeah, just sometimes it helps to sort of just imagine what it could be. And I think it really helps because you will get asked at some point, right? At some
Yeah.
point, some leader will sit you down and be like, well, what do you want? And they will ask you this question. And it may not be exactly like IC or manager, pick one. It might be, do you want to go for the principal track, or do you want to be a staff engineer over identity or whatever in the business? So like, I think it helps to sort of imagine that ahead of time and think about what would it look like if I did those things? Are there people that do those things today that you might want to like build your own network with? But even if there aren't, and you can't do that, at least like having an idea about what kind of IC you would be, I think could be really helpful because it can guide a lot of your decisions. You can say like, oh, would staff engineer Nick do this or not? Right. And you can go,
Yeah.
oh, if staff engineer Nick wouldn't do this, I'm probably not going to do this, even if it's like important. Or oh, staff engineer Nick would definitely reach out to this other team and make this connection on this thing we're working on together. Like then do that. So I think imagination, we don't like do that enough, right? Like I love Nick's point about sort of trying it out, but also like just think about what could it look like, and if you can come up with do those things, you'll get feedback very quickly, right? Whether you're changing behavior based on what you could imagine, or even just based on what you've been asked by leaders that are trying to figure out maybe there's a reorg coming up and they want to know where to put you. Like just spending some time thinking about it is hugely useful, I think, for when this conversation comes up.
Get to know yourself, because it's what's going to drive what you're going to do. So,
for sure.
Sense. All right, Nick, Martin, thank you both so much for coming on.
Great to talk to you both.
Yeah, you bet. This was awesome. Thank you.
Woohoo. Thank you. Say bye. Bye.
Adios.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Technically Leadership. Feedback is a gift that I treasure. So please find me on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Mastodon, or the Packet Pushers Slack. Or you can send feedback through the form at packetpushers.net/FU. By the way, that stands for follow-up. Links to all of those spots are in the description and show notes. Share this episode with your friends and colleagues, and let me know if you have someone you think I should talk with about leadership. For now, though, go lead.